Good evening and welcome. Noswit Dada a Croeso. Thank you to our alumni, staff, donors, prospective students, friends and supporters for joining us here this evening. This evening's East African alumni event will be recorded. We will send you the recording link following the event, which you are most welcome to share. Please allow me to introduce myself. I am Professor Urfan Khalik. I'm a professor of international law, and I am the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences here at Cardiff University. You are here this evening as part of the Cardiff community, comprising graduates and friends who are here and we are supporting and learning the learning and the research of the university, Alumni attendees will be invited for a short networking event immediately following the webinar. Of course, most of our attendees are joining us tonight are based in Cardiff, Nairobi, Kampala, and Dar es Salaam. But we also have others joining us from the United States of America, Burundi, Ethiopia, and Zambia, to name just a few. It is a particular honor to welcome you all. Just a few words about Cardiff University, and then I will move on to introducing our speakers. As many of you know, we are a member of the prestigious Russell Group of Research Intensive Universities, and Cardiff University has just been named, I'm delighted to share with you, the Welsh University of the Year in the Times and Sunday Times Good University Guide of 2022. Our international office usually visits East Africa up to 5 times a year, and we are privileged to have more than 60 students with us from East Africa who make a most valuable and active contribution to our student body. We have an extremely long history of welcoming East African students to study with us, and tonight's event demonstrates our commitment to maintaining them with the Cardiff family. I recall very well myself over the years having numerous students from Kenya, Tanzania, and also Uganda. So enough about the university. Let me introduce you on to the speakers for tonight and the most exciting things they have waiting for you. We have 2 panelists for this evening's event. Our host is James Smart, who is a Chevening Scholar at Cardiff University, where he completed his postgraduate studies in international journalism at the world-famous School of Journalism, Media and Culture in 2016. James is now a successful broadcast journalist based in Nairobi. Our other panelist this evening is Professor Ambreena Manji, who has been with the Cardiff University School of Law and Politics since 2014. Particular pleasure for me to welcome Ambreena to you all, as Ambreena is a colleague from the School of Law and Politics, where I was previously based. Ambreena, prior to joining the school, was seconded to Nairobi as the director of the British Academy's British Institute in East Africa, and she was there between 2010 and 2014. Her outstanding international research reputation is in African law and society. It is strongly interdisciplinary in nature and includes work on law in African literature, African history, legal education, and women and the law. So those are our 2 speakers. Just a few logistics for the event. We will hear from James, Ambreena, and Smith shortly, and following this, we will have an opportunity for questions and some answers. We've already received some questions in advance from you, but if you would like to ask, please enter them in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try and answer as many questions as time allows. But for now, I'm delighted to ask James to do what he does very best. Welcome and croeso to you all.
Thank you very much, Prof. Those are very kind words. I want to thank everyone who's joining us to this first Alumni East Africa Cardiff event. It's good to see you all, and we should have more of this. Let's get straight into it. Now, the book titled The Struggle for Land and Justice in Kenya by Professor Ambreena Manji explores the protracted conversation on land reforms and land law reforms. The former Chief Justice of Kenya, Professor William Mutunga, said this in relation to this book, that no part of the law of Kenya has raised stronger emotions over the years than the law relating to land and its administration, and none is of more importance at present. Now, this book explores with great detail the history of land reforms, its basis in politics, and most importantly, land law reforms, which have been anchored in Kenya's 2010 constitution. Anything about land is bound to attract passions. and Professor Ambreena Manji in this book has provided perhaps yet another opportunity for land debates to be argued with both history, politics, and legal questions being in the room. And that's what I mean fit as well. I'd like to let you know that you can, as we continue the conversation, to send in your questions on our chat box on Q&A. We'll be happy to take those questions. But let me welcome Professor Ambreena Manji to make introductory remarks. Professor, this is, as very well stated, conversations about land and land law reforms. They're always passionate conversations. Give us a little of a background about this book. How did you come to write about this specific topic?
Thank you, James. Let me start by saying that this book, like the work of many established academics, was not something that happened in a short space of time. You yourself will know research sometimes has to be allowed to develop over a long period, and that this book is precisely that sort of work. I would say there was probably a decade of work on the book, because I really started to work on Kenyan land issues from around 2010 when I was seconded to Nairobi to the British Institute. Before that, I had also worked on land issues, but I'd worked predominantly in Tanzania, where I did my PhD fieldwork, and then in Uganda. So when I was seconded to Nairobi to run the British Institute, it was not at all my intention to work on Kenyan land issues. As you say, they are not simple issues. And I had, in fact, I had deliberately stayed away. I'm a Kenyan myself, but I had stayed away from writing on land in Kenya. And I devoted the first part of my career to writing on Tanzanian land law. I had been very closely involved with debates about the new land legislation there in the late 2000s. I had been particularly interested in gender and land rights. And it was only on arriving in Nairobi in 2010, when the new constitution was being inaugurated, that Yash Palgai approached me and asked if I would work with him on the particular implications of the constitution, which he had drafted, as you know, and worked on in a very dedicated way for a decade, whether I would work with him on the particular implications of that constitution for land issues. And any of you on this call who know Yash Palgai will know that if Yash asks you to do something, you don't say no. So I became interested in the debates in Kenya about the chapter in the constitution relating to land, chapter 5, and particularly interested in how we were going to make real some of the aspirations in that chapter. Because all the chapters of the Constitution have a history behind them of great struggle. Every single one of those chapters was arrived at by a process of contestation and debate. But no chapter, I think, is more important than the chapter on land, because for the chapter on land for me encompasses all of the values of the Constitution, all of the ideas of participation, fairness, equity, redistribution, that the rest of the Constitution also embodies. So how are we going to make these constitutional aspirations? The Constitution is just a document. It has aspirations in it. How are we going to make these real for citizens, for real people who wanted to see change? And what might that change look like? So I worked very closely with Yash Palgai and with his Katiba Institute to think about how land bills might be drafted, which brought the aspirations of the Constitution into the form of legislation. That is not a simple process. It's not simply a matter of pulling through constitutional language, which is written at, which is at a certain level of abstraction, into very concrete land laws. And of course, the contestations continued. Nobody could agree about how these bills should look. So I worked very closely on commenting on the land bills as they were being drafted, particularly pointing out some of their pitfalls, trying to influence the relevant committees in Parliament, trying to have conversations about how the land legislation might be better done, and particularly drawing attention to some of the dangers that we were facing. For example, in creating new institutions by land legislation, we needed to be very sure that the kinds of institutions we were building would last into the future and would be guaranteed guarantees would guarantee us that we would break with some of the practices of the past, and that we would be able to ensure some degree of fairness and justice in relation to land. So in particular, don't forget, in Kenya, we were very ambitious. We decided that we were going to have our process of constitutional reform and our process of devolution at the same time. Sometimes I wonder whether we shouldn't have staggered this process, whether we shouldn't have done constitutional reform first and then thought about the devolution experiment. These are two massive things, and to do them together at the same time was remarkably ambitious. In a way, you can't separate them. You could not have done them separately. So how were we going to do this well? How were we going to make sure that devolution in the land domain worked as well as we could possibly make it work? And how were we going to make sure that it stood the test of time?
Thanks, Prof. Just a follow-up on these questions that obviously it's difficult to entangle them together, but they are coming together. And this is a question of what we aspire to do in law, which it's always been there. It's been part and parcel of sort of like the Kenya ethos, if you like, that, you know, we need to get better laws to fix the land problems that we have. But then you also make a good point that the law itself might be good, might be solid, but there are other factors which actually influence the question of land reforms itself. So at what point would you say that where we are, according to, you know, just your research on the land laws themselves and the institutions we've built since 2010, vis-a-vis the reforms themselves, right? Those are two separate different things. Where would you say we are in?
Okay, so this is a great question, James, because what it points to, I think, is that, and this is particularly true if you've had a legal training, it's very difficult to stand back from the law and to try to think critically about the work that the law is doing. And this is one of the great strengths of the way, for example, that we teach law at Cardiff, that it's precisely this being able to stand back from the law that gives our lawyers something of a cutting edge intellectually. So what I mean by that is that schools which teach law in a more critical way, or what you might describe as a more socio-legal way, try to impress on our students that you cannot understand the law only from the standpoint of legislation, the constitution, etc., just from the standpoint of legal studies. You must understand law in its context. So those of us like me with that kind of training would argue, if all you try to do is to reform the law, you will be badly disappointed. And actually beyond that, I'd go a step further than that in my argument, and I would say it's just possible that sometimes law is actually doing not good work, but bad work. Why do I say that? I have become completely convinced in the Kenyan context that actually our obsession with land law, with reforming law in the land arena, has actually been a disadvantage. Now, that's a painful thing to hear from my fellow lawyers, but I think it's true. I think we've rather become a bit seduced by law and by legal reform. And I think we haven't asked ourselves difficult questions about our history in relation to law. So in Kenyan history, it was never the absence of law that was the problem. Law was always used as a tool of dispossession. We could give you countless examples of this. The book has many, but in relation, for example, to indigenous people. when the British dispossessed the Maasai of their land, they didn't do so simply by taking that land forcefully. They actually entered into legal treaties with the Maasai. Law underpins colonialism. And similarly, we then expect law to be the solution to some of those long-running historical wrongs. Could it not be that law is actually the problem, in the sense that by being very focused on law, we might have missed other important debates that we should have been having in the land arena? And that's the thrust of this book. My argument in the book is, by focusing only on law, we've missed some really important debates that should have been happening and didn't. And those are debates in the arena of the economy, political science, history, even literature, which are debates about how do we wish land to be distributed? What does it mean to have a fair distribution of land? What would that look like? What do people use their land for? Why do people wish to have land? What does it tell us about Kenyans that people wish to have, even if it's a small amount of land? What is people's attachment to the idea of having land? And what is people's attachment to where their land is or should be? And unless you can have those much bigger, almost philosophical discussions about land and belonging, land and identity, land and meaning, land and citizenship, actually, you can't do good work in the legal arena. Those discussions should be prior to everything else. Now, that's a difficult thing to tell your fellow lawyers. But I think I've been right in this interpretation or analysis. I think all of the problems that we've seen since the Katiba and since the new land legislation suggests that I'm right. Why? Well, because the Gini coefficient on land in Kenya, the measurement by which we can check inequality in relation to land holding, the Gini coefficient on land in Kenya has worsened since 2010. If our constitution was working and if our land laws were working, 3 new land laws since 2012, and then a subsequent series of bills reforming those laws in 2016. If they were working, we wouldn't have such a bad Gini coefficient on land. Something is not right. And the question is, are the lawyers the right people to explain to you what's not right?
And Prof, you make this point, I think, on chapter 5, when you say the existing institutional framework for land and administration and management is highly centralized, complex, and exceedingly bureaucratic. As a result, it is prone to corruption and has not been able to provide efficient services. In addition, it does not adequately involve the public in decision-making with respect to land administration and management, and is thus unaccountable. And I was just going through this and reading through this, and I thought about, where the premise of this whole conversation about land and land reforms and the low land reforms, and this sort of like question of what is land for, which you sort of bring about. There's an attachment to land, if we sort of widen of what people, citizens, think land is for. It's the place we call home. It creates some sort of identity, sort of a society. We have those sort of attachment to that in one part. The other part is obviously that we also believe land should be a factor of production. Yeah. And it's a business and it's economy. And these are very complex things. And would you say we are close to resolving this question? Or are we even at any point close to putting this as the central question for citizens, essentially to sort of have a communal discussion about it so that we build a consensus around it?
I don't think we are. I don't think we're close enough to understanding that land is a factor of production. It is, necessary for people to produce food, to have as a backup. Even, we saw this during COVID, for example, James, even urban citizens with jobs in the city need the backup of some food coming in from land which they have back home. We saw it consistently, buses coming in from the rural areas to supply food. Why? Because wages are not sufficient alone in Nairobi, really, for people to live. Okay, so land is a factor of production, but it's also a factor of reproduction. What does that mean? It means that the land is about families, about heritage, about community, about your notion of belonging, who you're a citizen, where you're a citizen. And that has always been true in Kenyan history. Now, I think we're so focused on land as a factor of production that we don't think enough about land as a factor of reproduction. What does it mean for people to ask for fairer distribution of land? What they're asking for is a fairer, they're asking for recognition by the state that they also want the fruits of development. Now, the story is slightly different in the urban context. And I'm very glad Smith is with us this evening, because I think he will say a little bit more about his work. In the urban context, which is where Smith is really focused, we have a conversation, I think, that needs to happen about insecurity. So the questions here are different. Insecurity in access, in other words, the lack of tenure security in urban contexts leaves people exceptionally vulnerable. So we see this all the time in relation to evictions. Any of us who are based in a major Kenyan city will see repeatedly, cycle after cycle, of evictions of the poor from what are not very, are not good conditions of living. The very least that they could demand is some security over those homes. These are people who play a role in the economy. They play a crucial role in the economy. The city would come to a standstill if it were not for the labor that these people do. Yet they're completely invisible. They go away to their homes in the evening, and we don't actually think very much about what do they go home to. So I would really say to people on this call, if you wanted to understand the land issue in Kenya, actually the place to do it is in front of our very noses. Many of us will be based in cities, in the city itself, where the skewed nature of land ownership is very clear. Where, there are some people in the city who have a great deal of security of tenure and very good access to land, and then there are those who live absolutely at the margins of the city and of the land law system as a whole. And it's that for me, that's the most important discussion that we need to have. What does it mean when people demand security of tenure? What does it actually mean to their living conditions?
Well, I just want to remind everyone on this call that we're taking your questions on the Q&A chat box at any time. Just drop in your questions, and then at the end of this, we'll be able to get through your questions. Prof, let's just sort of expand this a bit into the wider context of East Africa, if you like. Do Kenyans, Ugandans, Tanzanians, have sort of the same affinity about land, have the same sort of legal questions around land? And where would you see that this book actually sits in terms of research and resolving this question about East Africa, as the question of land in East Africa at large? Okay, so there are similarities, and then there are, I think, major differences. So in relation to Tanzania, for example, I mentioned earlier that my early work was on Tanzania. The debate there was about, those of you who might have known this debate in Tanzania, was about, as in Kenya, highly centralized systems of land holding. So in Tanzania, radical title to land is held by the president, as it was in Kenya. What that means is that the president had massive power over the allocation of land. That is a very similar debate to the debate about centralized land holding in Kenya, a system in which a kind of what's been called by the political scientists an imperial presidency has control over this very important resource.
that's a similarity between us, for example, and Tanzania. And one of the things that the land reforms in Tanzania in the 2000s wanted to do was to break that hold and to put title and put control of land into the hands of ordinary citizens, which is why the Village Land Act was created to decentralize control over land. The difference, I think, and it's really important for us in Kenya to recognize this, is our history of settler colonialism. That did mean that land in Kenya, in terms of ownership, land is much more skewed because millions and millions of acres of land went into the hands of settler colonial families, people. And even at independence, when many of those people were bought out under various schemes, even at that point, the distribution of land didn't change. Some people became very, very wealthy and some people were impoverished. Why? Because Isa Shivji, the Tanzanian professor of law based in Dar es Salaam, writing about Kenya, made the argument, we had in Kenya a racialized system of landholding, and at independence, all that happened was that system of landholding became ethnicized. It never really changed fundamentally in terms of distribution. And that's very important because unless we understand the historical roots of our land system, we can't really start to address some of its major shortcomings. So Tanzania and Uganda are very different indeed. I also think that on, for example, questions of women's access to land, all three countries are very different. So if you're interested, any of you on this call, I would really urge you to read the debates in Uganda about women's ownership of land. Very interesting. There was a debate in the 2000s about statutory spousal co-ownership. I don't know if you remember this, James, but there was a big debate about what about making it the law that any property acquired during marriage will automatically be co-owned equally between spouses. At first sight, great. Okay, but who were the major opponents of this in Uganda in the 2000s? Women, middle-class women. Why? I'm not sharing my land that I acquired during my marriage and worked hard to acquire with a useless man, right? So very interesting. And you see sometimes those debates crop up, 20 years later, as we have the same kinds of debates in our courts, not so much in the law legislation, but in our courts about what does it mean for spouses on separation to divide their property equally between them, right? So I think we don't do enough to share between us, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, but also Southern African perspectives. I think South Africa is a really important example for us. What were the land debates there? How far did they also rely on their constitution, just as we did? And how far have they succeeded? Really important, I think, if you're interested in land issues, to see those, to read those literatures together. I don't think any one of these jurisdictions can be studied in isolation because there are far too many overlaps and far too many lessons across them.
Thank you, Prof. I realize we've been going on for half an hour, and I realize we can go on forever between me and you. So I'd like to include everyone else into this conversation. I'd like now to introduce Smith Ouma, who to briefly share some of his reflections and to join us join for the Q&A sessions after his reflections. Now, Smith researches and writes on structural, legal, and social barriers to the right to health and on access to land. His doctoral research focuses on how participatory urban land use planning can be used as a tool for improving health outcomes in informal settlements under the supervision of Professor Ambreena Manji, I've been talking to, and Professor John Harrington. Smith is a recipient of the Cardiff University Vice Chancellor's International Research Excellence Scholarship. Smith, welcome. The floor is yours to give us some reflections.
Great. Thank you, James. Thank you, Ambreena, for the very insightful conversations on a very important topic. I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate Ambreena for exemplary work, which was an African Studies Association-based book finalist. So I will, in the next 3 to 5 minutes, share a few thoughts on what has been said by Ambreena and James, and then we will open the floor for any questions that you may have as the participants. Please remember to post any questions that you may have in the Q&A section, and we shall attend to them soon after this. So on to my reflections. I think to begin with, Ambreena and I have had conversations on numerous occasions, and our common conclusion has always been that there's need for alternate frameworks or alternate ways of framing how land is talked about, how land is written about, and how land is basically talked about. And this conclusion, we're right at this conclusion based on the fact that we as lawyers have always dominated these conversations on land to the detriment of other stakeholders whose contributions are often disqualified as being inadequate. I would then like to reiterate Ambreena's call in the book that any reform programs must aim at a deeper and broader change below legal reform. So we need to orient our focus to other aspects of land reform, not just on legal reform. We are all cognizant of the fact that land issues are often entangled in history. Land issues are often entangled in class issues. Land is often entangled in religion, culture, and politics. And by politics, I mean both local, at a very local level. We also have politics at a national level, and also we have global politics that influence how land is administered and managed within any context. Could be Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. And we are also aware that in Kenya, for instance, and in the wider region, land reform has for far too long not given adequate consideration to these other issues, these social political issues which underlie these land challenges that we always seek to address. So not enough attention has been paid on these social political issues that underlie the land challenges. And law and legal reform has frequently been thought of as the silver bullet that is needed to correct the ills that bedevil land governance. And this explains why, for instance, the often expansive legal provisions that we've enacted in our laws, for instance, in Kenya, have in most cases failed to materially alter the condition. So we see that we have very expansive protections, not only in the Constitution, we have protections in the different land legislations and in the different land regulations, but there are still challenges bedeviling land issues in Kenya. We, for instance, see this with regards to the implementation of the Community Land Act. Despite its expansive provisions, we see communities in places like Isiolo, we see communities in places like Elgeyo Marakwet, the Mau Forest, for instance, still faced with the very same problems that they had before these laws came into effect. So essentially, approaching reforms from this very limited perspective does not cure all the ills that in a way inform land issues in East Africa. So Ambreena's book is a unique contribution in that it asks very pertinent questions that challenge how and who talks about land. It also asks us whether we need to reorient our focus to other ways of seeing and speaking about land, or what Grace Musila refers to alternate registers of knowledge. And this, for instance, we can see this in urban contexts where we have informal registers, we have conversations on the streets that can guide us or that can tell us a story about how land is owned, for instance, within these informal settlements. It is my strong belief, therefore, that the questions that Ambreena poses in a book can facilitate a much better understanding of land, not just in East Africa, but in the wider region. So at this point, I'll take us back to James, who will guide us through the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Smith, for your thoughts on this conversation and building it up and including other questions that we should consider. I'd like to open the Q&A session now. If you haven't done so already, audience members, please ask your question below on the chat box on the Q&A, and I'll be able to see them and take them up. In that we'll do in the next 10 or so minutes. Here's the thing, on what we need to, you can ask basically about anything. You can ask about what about the discussions today, or if you'd like, ask me and Smith about our advice regarding, university search in Cardiff, what factors went into our decision to choose the sort of specific places that we chose in Cardiff. And if you just want to talk about something as, life in Cardiff as well, we'll be available for that. But let me start with a question right now that has been brought about. The question for both Smith and Professor Ambreena. The question is this, that the issues about land and this sort of cases about land tend to take far too long anywhere in East Africa. It's almost like the last bastion of justice, if you like, that once there's a land question, the courts are almost impossible for them to resolve it. It takes a long time. Poor people who do not have money essentially get dragged out in court. Would you see, just from your own experience and research, that this is something that needs either to be investigated a bit on sort of like the level of what part of cases in courts, East African courts, constitute land questions independently alone? How long do courts take to resolve other matters and land matters in particular? And if that is of value and worthy as sort of research to give us new insights, if you like. So let me start with you, Smith, and I'll go to Professor.
Thank you. That's a very important question, and a very practical question, because what we see in the backlog of cases, for instance, when you go to the law courts in Nairobi, and I believe the law courts in Kampala also, and in Dar es Salaam, you'll find the backlog of cases are predominantly occasioned by the land cases in those courts. And in Kenya, for instance, we even decided to, in a way, come up with a specialized court in the name of the Land and Environment Court, specializing not just on land and environment issues. And even despite that, we still see that there's still backlog of cases. I believe right now there's people who are getting mention dates for towards the end of 2022, which tells you that if you have an urgent land dispute, then there's no chance that by the end of 2022, that matter will still be urgent. And I believe the problem arises from the way in which land issues, we haven't provided alternative platforms for addressing these land grievances, so that the use of the law and the use of the courts has really been given too much importance, so that most people will think that if they have the slightest land dispute, that the court is the best platform, or the courts are the best platforms to address these grievances. It is a failure on our parts to also recognize and also recognize the importance of these alternative platforms for dispute resolution. We have traditional dispute resolution platforms. We have ADR mechanisms that can be used to address this land, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that can be used to resolve some of these land challenges. But there's too much focus on the courts, which have limited resources and also have limited expertise with regards to these land matters. So I think in summary, we just need to ensure that we also give importance to the alternative platforms or the other platforms of land dispute resolution.
All right, thanks, Prof.
It's a great question. And I'd say three things. One is, a legal anthropologist would say to you, if you want to understand land problems, land disputes, the last place you should go is the law courts. Most land disputes don't get to the courts. That's just the very top of the pyramid. We all know this, right? Where else can we study them? Think about that. I think if I were starting a research project, I would say, think about other places in which people resolve their disputes. Don't take a state-centric, court-centric approach to your research, and try to think about how else people knowing very well that the court system, the judicial system will not serve them, look for alternative means, and there you will find great creativity. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is, it's clear that there's a problem. The Land and Environment Court, the Supreme Court, our courts are full of cases brought by the rich, employing rich lawyers. This was never the intention. Justice Mumbi Gugi said it to us about, I think he was talking to us about health litigation in the High Court. This was not our intention. Our intention was not that, lots of wealthy people would be able to tie up court time. Our intention was to give increased grounds of standing in the Constitution so that anyone could bring an action before our courts. And we thought this would allow civil society and allow progressive groups and progressive actions to be brought. Instead, that's in fact it's not what's happened. That's a disappointment. But the more positive third thing I'd say is, despite all of these criticisms of the court system being blocked up, etc., when we do have jurisprudence out of some of these cases, including in the Land and Environment Court, it is often brilliant jurisprudence. And that, I think, is a really positive thing to hold on to. Our judiciary is doing amazing work in terms of providing really well-argued, creative, clever judgments. Those are all available. This is the other thing to mention, is that all of these are available if you're a law student, if you're thinking about doing research in law, all available now through the Kenya Law website. You can download them, you can read them, you can critique them. And that in a way has brought the law closer to the people. I think we underestimate this in Kenya. I think it's probably more true in Kenya than it is in Tanzania and Uganda, just simply because our constitutional debates are more recent. Our understanding of law in Kenya is outstanding. Our public understanding of law, our citizens' engagement with law and legal issues, not just land. It's really excellent. So we should hold on to that idea as a real positive.
Yeah. I have a quick follow-up question, Professor, from our chat box. And the question is, what are the alternative legal land dispute solving mechanisms apart from the conventional courts?
Often families, often I think family elders, communities, those would be places that I would go to look. Smith might have different ideas in the urban context, which actually I'd be very interested to hear how people avoid the court system, knowing very well it won't serve them. Smith, in the urban context, what would you speculate?
Indeed, I think in the urban context, and especially in informal settlements, or what are ordinarily referred to as slums, bringing disputes to court may be problematic, because in most cases, the individuals occupying those lands do not have title to the land. So the courts will be very hesitant to hear them. But within these informal settlements, within these slums, there are governance mechanisms. They have chiefs, they have village elders, they have opinion leaders, and they have their own systems that they use to solve some of these disputes. So that if somebody constructs their house on a piece of land that whose ownership is contested, then there are internal mechanisms within these informal settlements or these slums to solve some of these disputes. And that's why we're saying that the law and the courts are not necessarily the best platforms to solve all of these challenges that we see in land administration and governance.
All right. Unfortunately, we are out of time today. Ambreena and Smith, thank you very much for joining us and talking about your exciting research activities. I think it's obvious that we need more time and we need to do more of these events. I also want to thank our webinar audiences for being with us. I hope you found it insightful as we did. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we'll follow up with you directly. For our alumni and current students on the call today, please now check your inbox to find a private link for our networking meeting now, where we hope you can catch up with some old friends and make some new. We'll be starting as soon as this call ends. You should be receiving an email in the next few days with a copy of recording, which you're more than welcome to share with your friends interested in this topic of Cardiff University. Thank you very much for everyone who's come through. Thank you and goodbye. My name is James Smart. On behalf of Professor Ambreena Manji and Smith Home and the entire Cardiff University, please enjoy your breakout session that starts right now.